Okay, looks like we're about at the hour. Welcome everyone to the Guava and Osterman Research webinar today. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava, and I'll be your host. Today's webinar is titled The True ROI of Information Governance. We're really excited for the information and for this topic and for everyone for being here. Thanks again, everyone, for your attendance and hope that you get a lot from this presentation. And, of course, we're always pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Under his direction, we'll be discussing this topic, the true ROI of information governance. Michael is an industry expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry and has spent 16 of those years following specifically the messaging and collaboration industries. So we'll go ahead and give the time over to Michael. We'll go ahead and take it away.
Q, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody who's here today. I really appreciate that very nice introduction, and it's always a pleasure to be on a webinar with Guava. We're going to be talking about information governance today, and it's a topic that really is getting a lot more attention. We have focused heavily on information governance in the past and are going to be doing more so in the future simply because of the growth of data and so forth, and we'll get into all that in just a moment. A little bit about Osterman Research, just so you know our perspective on all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm, and as Q mentioned, our focus really is on messaging, web, and collaboration, focusing on the ways that people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. And so obviously we look at things like information governance and issues like security, archiving, encryption, content management, and so forth. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be going through a bit of that here today. And we like to talk to decision makers and influencers that are really in the trenches, dealing with this stuff on a daily basis, dealing with e-discovery requests or dealing with storage management. There's a wide variety of sort of nitty-gritty, difficult things to handle. And we like to talk to people who are managing that and who have an influence over that. The company is about 14 years old, and we're based near Seattle. So let's get right into it. We did a white paper that Guava co-sponsored, and we also did a survey as part of that white paper effort. And one of the things we wanted to find out is, where are organizations today with information governance? And so we spoke primarily to mid-sized and large organizations, mostly in North America, really to find out where they are in the whole context of information governance. And, by information governance, we're talking about how you manage information in your organization, how you manage email, stuff on file servers, social media, basically anything that might constitute a business record or that you might have to preserve for some length of time is really stuff that falls under the rubric of information governance. It's information you have to manage properly, and you have to manage it usually for very long periods of time. What we found in the survey is that just over one half of the organizations we surveyed have some sort of an information governance program in place. They've either started it or they're well on their way to managing information as part of an overall governance program. We also found that a little over a quarter of organizations, 27%, do not have an information governance program in place, and that another 1 out of 5 currently does not have one, but they plan to do so within the next 12 months. And from our perspective, information governance is really one of those really critical things that organizations have to do. This is not a nice to have. This is not a, well, that's a good idea and we need to get to it someday type of idea. This is something that organizations absolutely must do as part of best practices regarding their business records, regarding all of the information that they have to preserve for long periods of time. And so this is, really in the realm of archiving and security and content management. This is something that you absolutely must do as an organization, and it's not really, it's not really optional anymore. You have to govern information properly. So, why do we have an information governance problem in the first place? Well, it's in part it's because we have so much information. We have calculated, for example, through a variety of end user surveys, that the average email user, or the average information worker, sends or receives about 110 emails on any given day. About 25% of those emails contain attachments, and there's a lot of data being transmitted into organizations, outside of organizations, and within companies themselves. And so electronically stored information really is growing quite rapidly, and in a lot of organizations, it's really out of control. If you look at the typical organization, the IT will normally impose a file size limit on email. They'll impose a total a mailbox size quota on email and so forth. And so what we end up with is a situation in which end users run into email limits on a fairly frequent basis. Maybe there's a really large file that they need to send, so they'll send it through a personal email account, or they'll store it somewhere in Dropbox and send it that way. If they run into mailbox size quotas, they might be deleting information that they really should be retaining for long periods of time, or they'll store it on a file server somewhere on a USB stick. They'll store it on a home computer. They'll put it into their own Dropbox account and so forth. And so organizations are creating an enormous amount of data, and the result is that organizations over time are losing control of that data. One, because they have too much that they're not managing properly. And two, more and more of it is being put under employee control and stored in repositories that really are not accessible to the organization at large. And it's not because of any malicious intent on the part of employees. They just need to be able to do their job effectively. They're going to need information for long periods of time. They're going to need old presentations or documents, whatever the case may be. And so they're storing it pretty much willy-nilly in places that make sense for the way they do their work. But for the organization at large, it becomes very difficult to get at that information. Also, we find that organizations will habitually over-retain information. They will store information for very long periods of time, stuff that they really don't need to. If you were to go through the typical user's inbox, you'd find a lot of invitations to cake down the hall and really a variety of things that a variety of types of messages that really don't make any sense to keep for very long periods of time because they don't constitute a business record as such. And so organizations have lots of information that they really don't need. But if they need to go through e-discovery, they're going to have to cull through all this information and spend a lot of time and a lot of effort and expend a lot of money simply to go through the stuff that they don't really need for long periods. Also, the more data that becomes available at faster rates, the lower the chance it's going to be viewed or understood, and therefore the less value it really retains over time. For example, if you have a presentation that's 3 or 4 or 5 years old, it's probably not going to be very valuable. It might have some value to an organization if they want to go back and look at the historical record of what employees have done. But generally, as data ages, it becomes less valuable. But organizations are still retaining this data, largely because they don't have a good information governance program and they don't have a good way to classify the data in terms of its value to the organization. So one of the things we wanted to explore in the survey as well was, what are the biggest drivers for information governance? Why are organizations implementing an information governance program in the first place? And now, obviously, this is going to depend to a large extent on the industry you're in, how large your company is, the geographies that you serve, how distributed your employees are, and so forth. But what we find is that the primary reason for implementing information governance is risk avoidance. This was classified as an important or very important driver to implement an information governance program. And really risk avoidance applies to just about any industry, whether you're heavily regulated, as in the financial services industry, healthcare, energy, pharma, life sciences, or if you're in a less heavily regulated industry, basically everybody else, manufacturers, retailers, and so forth. It's really to avoid risk. It's to avoid not being able to access information when you need it for a regulatory audit, during a lawsuit, and so forth. It's also about avoiding the risk of having too much information and incurring excessive costs when you're going through those types of search capabilities or search functions. Also, regulatory risks. Another key driver for implementation of information governance. There's a notion out there that there are regulated and unregulated industries, and in fact, all of us are regulated to some extent. All of us have some sort of a regulatory obligation to retain data for long periods of time and to manage it properly. It's really just a matter of how heavily regulated you are, not whether or not you're regulated. Employee productivity is another key driver. We find that organizations that have good information governance programs in place also have better employee productivity because now information is easier to find. There's less of it to cull through when you're searching for information and so forth. E-discovery costs, another important driver, particularly for organizations that face a lot of litigation. If they can implement a good information governance program that's going to reduce the amount of information they have to deal with through each of those e-discovery requests, the better off they'll be from a cost perspective and also a time perspective in terms of producing the information. And then finally, storage costs. Not the primary driver, certainly, but another important driver to be able to reduce the amount of stuff you're storing so that you can reduce those overall storage costs. Now, in terms of the various information governance challenges, as noted here, it's things like e-discovery, complying with regulatory audits, information management, employee productivity, defensible disposition. How do you delete data and then have a good defense for why you have deleted that data if it ever comes up in a regulatory audit or in court and so forth. Storage management, security and privacy concerns becoming a much more important issue, particularly in places like Germany where privacy is really a critical issue and much more so than in the United States. So all of these really apply to information governance, and all of these are critical issues that organizations have to address. Now, again, the mix is going to be a little bit different based on the industry you're in, the size of the company, where you operate, and so forth. But all of these challenges are going to be facing you in the context of information governance, and these are all drivers. They should all be inputs as to how you implement an information governance program. Now, in terms of the cost of retaining too much data, what we find is that over time, as you store more and more data, the cost of that data it continues to go up. And, for the obvious reason that as you retain data for 3 or 5 or 7 years, according to regulatory statutes or, the advice of your legal counsel or the precedent set by the courts, whatever the case may be, obviously you're going to be storing more information, but you're also going to be storing a lot of information that you don't need. And as you can see here, the cost of discovering excess data when you're going, for example, through a regulatory audit or an e-discovery exercise, the cost of that excess data can be enormous simply because as you're storing more and more business records that you need to retain on a long-term basis, if you don't have a good information governance program in place, you're storing lots of stuff that you really don't need, stuff that is going to be non-responsive, for example, to an e-discovery request. And so you're going to be producing a lot of information. You're going to be handing it over to paralegals or lawyers. They're going to be going through information that they really don't need to be going through. There's a lot of information that you could have disposed of defensibly, but if you don't have a good information governance program in place, you're not going to be able to do that. And so the cost of all of this excess data that you produce as part of e-discovery is going to be enormous after a while, and it's going to be very difficult for organizations to continue managing the current processes they have without good information governance. What we also find is that a lack of information governance really can lead to a higher likelihood of breaches. We asked organizations, for example, if they'd ever been the target of theft of sensitive or confidential data, and thankfully, nearly 2/3 of organizations have said no, they have not been the target of a breach. But what we find is that about 1/3, or actually a little over 1/3, actually have been the target. We hear about the very high-profile breaches like Home Depot, Neiman Marcus, Target, lots of other companies, but there are thousands of these types of breaches that occur on a regular basis. And it's not necessarily just a hacker breaking in and, creating some sort of a very high-profile breach of a well-known brand, but it's also, the smaller breaches, employees that will accidentally send a file off to the wrong individual, a laptop will be stolen, whatever the case may be. There are lots of situations where breaches have occurred and organizations' data, their customers' data, their business partners' data, and so forth has been compromised. And what's interesting here is that for 24% of organizations, they've been able to identify a breach by one or more outside parties, but there's been a substantial insider threat as well. For about 1 out of 5 organizations we surveyed, they've had some sort of a data breach because of an employee. Maybe it was a mistake, again, sending out that email with sensitive data. Maybe it was an employee that just got laid off and stole data, or they're preserving data on a home computer to do work in violation of a variety of corporate policies or regulatory statutes and so forth. And for about 1 out of 16 organizations, they've been breached, but they really don't know who it was. They don't have a good handle on where the information went, who accessed it, in many cases even when it occurred. And so we're finding that without good information governance in place, and certainly security and archiving and so forth are all part of that, if you don't have all of those systems in place under the umbrella of a complete information governance program, you will suffer a higher likelihood of breaches. Now, information governance, will not guarantee that you never have any sort of a data breach, but it's an important step to reduce the impact of data breaches, both in terms of their frequency and also in terms of your ability to speed the process of identifying them and shutting them down as quickly as possible. So in terms of information governance metrics, how do you evaluate the value of an information governance program? How do you determine how much you're saving, what the value is to your overall organization? Well, certainly there are some hard cost metrics you can apply here. Certainly the e-discovery collection process. You know how much data you need to, or you should know how much data you need to collect as part of e-discovery, as part of the review process and so forth. And so you can identify the cost per gigabyte or the cost per document, whatever metric you want to use. You can identify what that cost is. And so as part of an e-discovery effort, or maybe as a part of a regulatory audit, if you can reduce the amount of data that you're producing, you can now establish some very hard cost metrics to determine how much you're saving, because you have a good information governance program in place and you're reducing the amount of produced information. You can also quantify the storage savings, establishing a cost of storage per gigabyte over, let's say, a period of 7 years, if that's your retention period for some types of data. You can also identify end-user productivity gains. Users have to spend less time searching for information or producing non-responsive data when they're looking for information they need to do their work. There are also some softer metrics that you can apply here, things like revenue gains from recovered employee productivity. If your employees are more productive, that gives them more time to work on revenue-generating activities, for example, and also risk avoidance, avoiding major data breaches, the loss of reputation that can ensue from that, and so forth. And we believe it's particularly important to include both hard cost and soft cost metrics, although a lot of organizations, a lot of decision makers want to focus only on the hard costs because they can specifically identify those. The cost of damage to reputation, for example, trying to evaluate the cost of lost future revenues and so forth. These are more difficult things to evaluate in terms of their overall impact. I want to apologize for our phone going off. It's not supposed to be doing that. So in terms of both the hard and soft costs, we recommend looking at both, even though a lot of organizations, a lot of decision makers want to look at only one of those, and usually that's hard costs. So let's look at some of the benefits of information governance. And we can't go through all of these in as much detail as in the white paper, but at the end of the presentation, we do offer a link to the white paper, and we encourage you to download it because we have a lot of supporting information here, a lot of detail, and we break down the costs in terms of all of the assumptions that we use to generate this data. So we're going to assume for this analysis that we have an organization of 2,000 employees and that we have to go through a total of 7 e-discovery events per year. Now, obviously, this is going to vary. Obviously, there's a lot of companies out there of different size, and some organizations may have very few e-discovery requests. Some may be going through 30 a month. So it's really going to depend upon your specific situation. Also, we've made the assumption that there's going to be about 110 emails per user per day that are generated, and we've also made assumptions about the size of emails and attachments and so forth. So what we're looking at, if you implement a good information governance program compared to a state of not having information governance in place at all, we're looking at storage savings over a 5-year period of time after getting the IG program in place of about $2.5 million. Now that comes from obviously storing less email, storing fewer files, having less archive storage required for all of this content and so forth. But we're looking at roughly $2.5 million for a 2,000 employee organization. Now in terms of the e-discovery cost savings, we're looking at substantially higher value from the information governance program, largely because you're producing less information as part of an e-discovery request, and so you're turning over less information to paralegals or lawyers, and if they're going to be charging $150 or $350 an hour to cull through information, you can very clearly identify just how much you'll be saving per document that you don't turn over to legal, per gigabyte that you don't turn over, and so forth. And so in terms of the overall value of information governance, certainly e-discovery is going to give you the most bang for the buck. And again, this is going to depend upon your particular situation. If you go through only one e-discovery event per year, you're still saving several $million simply by having a good information governance program in place. Now, we've also looked at employee productivity savings over 5 years and the lost revenue recovered over that 5-year period because of better employee productivity. And again, we're looking at upwards of $10 million in savings from a good information governance program simply because your employees are now more productive and they can potentially generate more revenue for your organization. So again, your mileage is going to vary obviously based upon your particular situation, but for a typical 2,000 employee organization, we're looking at some significant benefits from implementing a good information governance program. Now, in terms of the return on investment, again, this is going to vary quite a bit based on the organization size and so forth. But we're looking at close to 500% to more than 800% return on investment per year in years 1 through 5 after implementing the information governance program. In terms of break-even times, we've made some assumptions in the white paper. Even very conservatively, you're looking at a payback period for the cost of a typical information governance program at less than 5 months. Now, this is going to vary to some extent based on how much you spend on the information governance program, how long it takes you to get up and running, what technologies you've implemented, and so forth. But even with a much more expensive information governance program than what we've assumed in this white paper, you're still looking at fairly quick break-even times in terms of being able to pay back the cost of that IG implementation and then significant return on investment after the fact. And again, ROI is going to be based on a variety of factors, the number of employees in your organization, what your labor costs are, because obviously if you have employees in New York City, you're going to have much higher labor costs than if you're in somewhere in the Midwest. It'll depend to a large extent on the number of e-discovery events that you're going through each year and also the overall cost of the information governance program. But bottom line here is that whatever you do in the context of information governance is almost certainly to have a relatively short payback period and provide you with a very significant return on investment. So in terms of conclusions, what we found is that a lot of organizations just have not yet implemented any sort of an information governance program. In theory, a lot of decision makers really understand, this is a good idea, this is something we should be doing, but there are very often priorities that get in the way. What we recommend is that organizations give this a very high priority and implement information governance, at least start on that journey as quickly as possible. Also, information governance without any sort of a program in place is really becoming a lot more difficult simply because of these increasing amounts of electronic information and the fact that most organizations over-retain content. And so you're generating lots of really valuable business records. You're generating lots of fluff, stuff that you really don't need to preserve for a long period of time. But if you don't have a good information governance program that includes a solid and robust defensible disposition capability, you're going to be retaining far too much information and your costs are going to be higher. You're going to have an increased risk of data breaches, more difficulty in accessing information that you need, and so forth. And bottom line is that good information governance will give you lower storage costs, much lower cost of e-discovery in most cases, improved employee productivity, and ultimately higher revenue because now the entire organization is operating more efficiently. And good information governance will result really in substantial ROI. Even with a really expensive information governance program and maybe relatively few e-discovery requests, you're still going to get very good ROI from that program. Okay, here's the white paper that we produced, for which Guava was a major co-sponsor. You can download it at your convenience at this URL. And here's our contact information. If anybody does have any more questions on the paper or the methodology that we used in the survey and so forth. Q, I'd like to turn it back to you and see if there are any questions.
All right. Thanks, Michael, for the information. Great information. And hope everyone can see the value of information governance and why you should be doing this. Thanks again, everyone, for being here, and thanks especially to Michael for the information presented and for being here and presenting to us.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.